On the morning of February 4th, 1880, in a farmhouse 25 kilometres northwest of London, Ontario, an 11-year-old boy crawled out from under a bed where he'd been hiding for less than an hour. His bare feet touched a floor slick with blood. Around him lay the bludgeoned bodies of 4 people he'd eaten dinner with the night before. The house was burning. He ran. By sunrise, 5 members of the Donnelly family were dead. James, 63. Johanna, 56. Thomas, 26. Bridget, 21. John, 32. Beaten with shovels and clubs, stabbed with pitchforks, shot at close range. Their farmhouse burned to ash around them. At least 20 men did this. Farmers, neighbours, people who'd known the Donnellys for decades, led by the local constable, blessed indirectly by their priest. They gathered at a schoolhouse, drank whiskey for courage, and walked 3 miles through February darkness with weapons in hand. They had a plan. They had a purpose. They had, in their minds, justification. This wasn't a robbery, wasn't a sudden rage, wasn't even a blood feud in the traditional sense. This was a community that decided one family had to be eliminated, and then did it, methodically, together. While an 11-year-old boy watched from under a bed, memorizing their faces. 2 trials followed. The boy testified, named names, described what he saw in detail so precise it left courtroom spectators nauseated. Dozens of witnesses corroborated his account. The evidence was overwhelming. No one was convicted. Not because the murders were unsolved. Everyone knew who did it. The entire township knew. The killers sat in church pews next to the surviving family members at the funeral. No one was convicted because the community decided these particular victims didn't deserve justice. This is the story of the Donnelly Massacre. Not a mystery, a choice. Made by ordinary people who convinced themselves that horror was justified, that some families could be erased, that some deaths didn't matter. If you think you know how people become killers, think again. If you think you know where you draw the line, you're probably wrong. This story will show you how close ordinary people are to unthinkable violence, how easily communities become conspiracies, how justice dies not with a bang, but with a shrug. To understand how 20 men came to murder 5 people on a February morning in 1880, you have to go back 40 years, to Ireland, to a young couple who thought leaving would save them. James Donnelly and Johanna Magee married in 1840 in Moneygall, County Tipperary. Eloped, actually. Her father refused permission, refused to let his daughter marry a man with no land, no prospects, no future in a country where Catholics owned almost nothing. So they married in secret, and her father never forgave either of them. Ireland in 1840. Stone cottages with thatched roofs, potato fields stretching toward grey horizons. The tithe war barely 10 years past. Catholics still paying taxes to support Protestant clergy, still remembering the violence that followed when they refused. James Donnelly looked around at this world and saw one truth clearly. He would never own anything here. Never control his own fate. Never be more than a tenant on someone else's land. So he left. Alone. First. 1842. Liverpool docks. Sailing ships crossing the Atlantic. 6 weeks in cramped quarters below deck. Arriving in Lower Canada with nothing but the clothes he wore and the certainty that even nothing in Canada beat everything he'd had in Ireland. Johanna followed 2 years later. 1844, bringing their son, James Jr., age 3, crossing an ocean to reunite with a husband she'd barely lived with, gambling everything on the promise that this new place, this British North America, would give them what Ireland never could. They weren't fleeing famine. The worst of the potato blight was still a year away. They were fleeing something worse than hunger, inevitability. The crushing certainty that their children would have exactly the same life they had. Same poverty, same powerlessness, same kneeling before landlords and magistrates and Protestant clergy who held every card and knew it. 450,000 Irish crossed to British North America before 1845. Most were Catholic. Most were poor. Most carried the same calculation James and Johanna did. Anything was better than knowing exactly how small your life would be. By 1845, the Donnellys had settled on Roman Line in Biddulph Township, Upper Canada, 25 kilometers northwest of London. Dense forest. Tree stumps everywhere, marking where settlers had cleared land, one axe swing at a time. Roads that were mud in spring, frozen ruts in winter, dust in summer. Isolation measured in miles of empty space between farmhouses. They cleared their land by hand, James swinging an axe in summer heat, felling trees, splitting logs, burning stumps. Johanna pregnant, then nursing, then pregnant again, working through it all because there was no choice. Building a log house, planting crops around the stumps, keeping chickens, pigs, a cow if they could afford one. The work that breaks your back and calluses your hands and makes you old by 40. But it was theirs. That land, that house, that future. No landlord could evict them. No tithe collector could seize their harvest. They owned something, finally, and they would defend it. Between 1841 and 1857, Johanna Donnelly gave birth to 8 children. James Jr., 1841. William, 1845. John, 1847. Patrick, 1849. Michael, 1851. Robert, 1853. Thomas, 1854. And finally, only daughter Jane, called Jenny, 1857. 7 sons and a daughter, growing up in a log house on Roman Line, learning to work as soon as they could hold tools, attending the one-room schoolhouse when farm work allowed, speaking with Irish accents that marked them as outsiders, even as they were born in Canada. Here's what matters about Johanna Donnelly. In 1861, she donated land for that schoolhouse, gave it freely to the township, then signed a contract to clean the school and cater community events. The school where her children studied, the community where she'd lived for 16 years. Think about what that means. A woman who'd arrived with nothing, who'd spent nearly 2 decades breaking land and raising children in isolation, who could barely write when she'd left Ireland. She valued education enough to give land away for it, valued community enough to work for it, valued the future enough to sacrifice present resources. She scrubbed floors in that schoolhouse, cooked meals for community gatherings, took payment in small amounts that helped feed her growing family. This wasn't charity. This was participation, investment in the place she'd chosen to build her life. Remember that detail. When the community decides she deserves to burn to death, remember that she gave them the schoolhouse. Remember that she worked for them. Remember that she believed in something larger than family vendetta. Remember, it didn't matter. By 1850, most landholders in Biddulph Township were Irish Catholics from Tipperary, the same counties, sometimes the same parishes. They'd brought their dialect, their grudges, their long memories of who'd wronged whom back in the old country. Ireland's feuds crossed the ocean intact, like seeds that would sprout in Canadian soil. Old country divisions, old country hatreds, new country land. The combination was unstable. And then, in 1857, James Donnelly killed a man. The land dispute had been festering for years. In 1855, John Grace sold their lot, Concession 6, Lot 18, to Michael Maher for £200. But the Donnellys were still living there, still working it, claiming squatters' rights or possibly holding a prior claim. The records are murky, contested. Exactly the kind of legal ambiguity that breeds violence on the frontier. Patrick Farrell acquired the disputed land. Farrell, who'd known the Donnellys back in Tipperary. Farrell, who announced publicly he intended to drive them off. Not just off the land, out of Biddulph entirely. Summer, 1857. A logging bee, when neighbours gathered to help clear land, everyone working together, whiskey flowing to make the labour bearable. Men stripped to the waist in the heat, the rhythmic sound of axes biting wood, the smell of pine sap and sweat. Farrell loud with drink, announcing again that the Donnellys had to go, that he'd bought the land fair, that squatters had no rights, that James Donnelly was a thief. James Donnelly, also drunk, arguing back, voices rising, other men backing away, sensing what was coming. And then the sound stopped. James Donnelly beat Patrick Farrell's skull in with a handspike, a metal rod used to lever logs, the fatal blow in front of a dozen witnesses, Farrell collapsing into sawdust, the sound of metal striking, again, rage beyond reason, violence beyond what was necessary. Farrell died there in the summer heat while men stood frozen, still holding their axes, watching a murder happen and doing nothing to stop it. James ran, hid for 2 years. While Johanna stayed on that disputed land with 7 sons and an infant daughter, defending their claim, living with the knowledge her husband was wanted for murder, living with neighbours who'd watched him kill a man, living with the reputation that would never wash clean. She could have left, gone back to Ireland, abandoned the claim, started over somewhere nobody knew the Donnelly name. She stayed, on that land, that blood-soaked piece of earth her husband had killed for. In 1859, James surrendered, was tried, convicted, sentenced to hang. Johanna Donnelly saved his life with paper and ink. She walked door to door through Biddulph Township collecting signatures, wrote letters in careful script to magistrates, politicians, anyone with power, argued self-defense. Farrell had threatened them, had been trying to drive them from their home, had started the confrontation. Farrell had been drunk. Farrell had been aggressive. James had reacted, perhaps too far, perhaps with too much force, but reacted to a threat. She visited Kingston Penitentiary, 3-foot-thick limestone walls, iron bars on windows barely wide enough for light, the smell of confined men and inadequate sanitation, and promised her husband she would get him out, that she would hold the land, that the family would survive. The sentence was commuted, 7 years instead of death. 7 years James Donnelly spent in Kingston Penitentiary, while his sons grew up without him. 7 years Johanna held the farm together, kept the family fed, earned money cleaning the schoolhouse she'd donated land for. 7 years raising 7 boys who were learning one lesson above all. The world wants to destroy you. Fight back. Never back down. Trust only family. Those boys went to school where other children taunted them. Your father's a murderer. Your father's in prison. Your family doesn't belong here. Your mother scrubs floors because your father's a killer. And the Donnelly boys fought. Every time. Came home with black eyes and split knuckles and bloody noses and the satisfaction of knowing they'd hurt the other boy worse. 7 brothers who would swarm anyone who insulted their family, who learned to use their fists before they were 10 years old, who earned a reputation for violence before their father ever came home. Teachers couldn't control them. Other parents complained. The Donnelly boys were trouble, dangerous, just like their father. But they kept attending school, because Johanna insisted, because education mattered to her, even when community opinion had already condemned her family. When James Donnelly was released in 1865, he came home to sons he barely knew. James Jr., 24, William, 20, John, 18, Patrick, 16, Michael, 14, Robert, 12, Thomas, 11. Boys who'd become young men in his absence, hard-drinking young men who'd learned to settle disputes with fists and clubs, because that's what the frontier taught them, who'd learned that family was the only thing you could trust, because everyone else would betray you eventually. And Jenny, 8 years old, the only daughter, the only one who remembered her father as something other than an absence. James Sr. came home to a family that functioned without him, to sons who looked at him with something between respect and resentment, to a wife who'd saved his life but couldn't save his relationship with children who'd grown up hearing he was a monster. The murder of Patrick Farrell defined the Donnelly family. Before it, they were just another Irish Catholic family trying to make it. After it, they were killers, criminals, people to avoid, people to fear. By the 1870s, The Donnelly family had a reputation that preceded them everywhere. Troublemakers, fighters, criminals. Some of it earned. There were arrests, there were fights, there were incidents that couldn't be explained away. Some exaggerated. Every unsolved crime in Biddulph got blamed on the Donnellys eventually. All of it impossible to escape in a township where everyone knew everyone, and memories lasted generations, and one murder could define a family for decades. But here's the complication that makes this story more than simple. The Donnellys also had Protestant friends. In Biddulph Township in the 1870s, this mattered more than almost anything else. The Irish Catholics who'd settled there hadn't left their sectarian hatreds in Ireland. They'd brought them intact, packed as carefully as their cooking pots and religious icons. Two factions formed, defined by old country terms. The Blackfeet, Catholics willing to associate with Protestants, willing to let the old feuds die in the new world, and the White Boys, militant Catholics who saw Protestant friendship as betrayal, who remembered the tithe war and land war and generations of oppression and refused to forgive, refused to forget, refused to move forward. The Donnellys were Blackfeet, proudly, defiantly. James donated money to help establish an Anglican church. The family attended Protestant social events, had Protestant friends who would later stand at their funeral, crying real tears, mourning people they'd actually cared about. This enraged a certain kind of Catholic, the kind who saw tolerance as treason, the kind who would rather see their community pure than peaceful, the kind who believed Catholic suffering in Ireland justified Catholic supremacy in Canada, the kind who would follow a priest who told them what they wanted to hear. In the late 1870s, a new priest arrived at St. Patrick's Church in Biddulph, Father John Connolly. Young, idealistic, fresh from Quebec. He looked at his parish, the drinking, the fighting, the endless feuds, the families who'd brought Irish violence to Canadian soil, and decided he would civilize it, save it from itself, bring peace through discipline and faith and community solidarity. He heard stories about the Donnellys from parishioners, biased stories, one-sided stories, stories told by people who hated the family and wanted validation for that hatred. Father Connolly listened, believed, decided the Donnellys were the problem. He began preaching against Protestant influence, against those who associated with Protestants, against the Blackfeet who, in his mind, were corrupting pure Catholic community. His sermons grew heated, passionate. He spoke of loyalty, of faith, of the need to protect Catholic identity against those who would water it down, compromise it, betray it. The congregation heard what he was really saying. The Donnellys are traitors. During one Sunday Mass, Father Connolly's sermon grew particularly heated. Anti-Protestant rhetoric from the pulpit. Words about loyalty and betrayal and the need to stand together against those who would destroy Catholic unity. The congregation nodding, agreeing. United in their righteous anger against the families, the Donnelly family specifically, who refused to hate Protestants the way they were supposed to. And James Donnelly stood up. Imagine that moment. St. Patrick's Church, built 1859, white clapboard, packed with worshippers. Sunday morning, the priest at the pulpit, voice rising in condemnation. And a man in the pews, a known troublemaker, an ex-convict, a man whose reputation had preceded him for 20 years, standing up in the middle of Mass. Silence spreading like ripples across water. People turning to stare. Father Connolly stopping mid-sentence, face frozen. James Donnelly's voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. Father Connolly was preaching hatred, not faith. The family would no longer attend this church. They would go to the Catholic parish in London instead. 25 kilometers away. They would travel that distance rather than listen to this poison. Johanna pulling at her husband's sleeve, trying to quiet him, trying to prevent exactly this kind of public scene. The Donnelly family standing, all of them, and walking out. Boots echoing on wooden floors. The sound impossibly loud in the shocked silence. Every eye following them, the priest's face transitioning from shock to rage, the door closing behind them, the mass continuing. But everything had changed. In that moment, James Donnelly made an enemy of the one man who could destroy him. Not with a weapon, with a congregation, with words from a pulpit, with the power to decide who belonged in the community and who didn't, with the authority to turn neighbors into a mob. Father Connolly would remember that humiliation, that public defiance, that rejection of his authority in his own church in front of his entire congregation, and he would do something about it. Meanwhile, the Donnelly sons were trying to build something legitimate. In 1873, William, Michael, John, and Thomas started a stagecoach business. Exeter to London, 25 kilometres. A profitable route when railways hadn't yet killed every coaching line in Ontario. Wooden coaches pulled by 4-horse teams, passengers paying for transport, mail contracts bringing steady income, a business built through years of labour, purchased with money earned, operated legally. For once, the Donnellys were doing everything right. Their main competitor was the Flanagan Company, also Irish, also Catholic, also fighting for the same routes, the same contracts, the same passengers. The kind of business rivalry that turns vicious when communities are small, and stakes are personal, and old country grudges are waiting for new excuses. The competition grew brutal. Slashed harnesses left horses injured. Spooked teams caused accidents. Fights at coaching stations left men bloodied, each side accusing the other. Each side convinced they were defending what was rightfully theirs. Each side probably right about some accusations, definitely lying about others. Then the Grand Trunk Railway extended to Sarnia. The stagecoach business started dying the way stagecoach businesses died everywhere. Slowly, then suddenly. Routes that had been profitable became marginal. The Donnellys and Flanagans fighting over scraps, over routes barely worth operating, over pride more than profit. Spring, 1877. A series of fires in Lucan, stables burning, horses screaming in burning buildings, the sound carrying across dark fields, waking families who ran toward the flames already knowing it was too late. Coaches destroyed, harness burned, feed reduced to ash, night sky orange with flames visible for kilometers, the smell of burning hay and horseflesh, equipment worth hundreds of dollars, a fortune for working families, reduced to smoking ruins. No arrests, no charges. Everyone knew who'd set those fires. Nobody could prove it. And maybe nobody wanted to prove it. Maybe some people thought the Donnellys had it coming. Maybe some fires were set by the Donnellys themselves, striking back at Flanagan, fighting fire with fire. The historical record is unclear because everyone was lying. The destruction was total because no one stopped it. By 1878, the Donnelly stagecoach business was finished. Years of work, gone. The family trapped again on that farm on Roman Line, surrounded by people who hated them, with no way to rebuild, no way forward, no way out, except to keep farming land that barely supported them. Just the land James and Johanna had fought for since 1845. That small piece of earth they'd killed for, bled for, defended for 33 years. 2 of the 8 children were already dead. James Jr., possibly shot in 1877 under circumstances that remain murky. Michael, killed in a bar fight in 1879. 5 sons remained. Plus Jenny, married now to Constable James Curry, moved to Glencoe, trying to escape the family reputation and mostly succeeding. And then, in 1878, Bridget Donnelly arrived from Ireland, Johanna's niece, born May 1st, 1858, 20 years old, coming to live with her aunt and uncle in Canada, arriving to a family and township she knew nothing about, just a young Irish woman seeking a better life, the same dream that had brought James and Johanna nearly 40 years earlier. Why did she come? We don't know. The records don't say. Maybe Ireland offered her nothing. Maybe Johanna wrote promising opportunity. Maybe family pressure pushed her toward relatives in the New World. Maybe she simply wanted adventure. She arrived to the Donnelly homestead knowing nothing of the feuds, nothing of the murder, nothing of the stagecoach wars or the fires or the hatred that had calcified around the family name over decades. Just her aunt and uncle, welcoming her, giving her a room, trying to help her build a new life. Bridget would live with the family for 18 months, learning Canada, meeting her notorious cousins, helping Johanna with housework, cooking, cleaning, sewing, the endless labor that defined women's lives on frontier farms. Writing letters home to Ireland, probably, though none survive. Forming impressions of this strange new place where Catholics and Protestants mixed freely, where land was plentiful, where the past was supposed to matter less. She had nothing to do with the feuds, knew nothing of the history, was, by every account, entirely innocent of whatever crimes, real or imagined, the Donnelly family had committed over 35 years in Biddulph Township. Remember Bridget. Remember that she was 21 years old when they beat her to death. Remember that she came seeking hope. Remember that innocence offered no protection when the mob decided the Donnelly family had to be eliminated. In January 1879, Father John Connolly arrived in Biddulph as the newly appointed priest of St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church. Young, idealistic, born in Ireland but arriving from Quebec. He looked at his parish, the drinking, the fighting, the endless feuds, the families who'd imported Irish violence to Canadian soil, and believed he could fix it. End the wild Biddulph days through faith and organization and community solidarity. He heard stories about the Donnellys from parishioners, one-sided stories. Stories told by people who hated the family and wanted validation for that hatred. Stories about violence, theft, arson, assault, every unsolved crime laid at the Donnelly door. Every missing item blamed on the Donnelly boys. Decades of resentment compressed into narrative form and delivered to an eager listener who had no context, no skepticism, no reason to doubt. Father Connolly listened, believed, decided the Donnellys were the problem, the source of lawlessness, the family that had to be controlled, corrected, or removed. He created the Biddulph Peace Society, encouraged parishioners to sign an oath. They would end crime, support law enforcement, hold each other accountable. 78 people signed openly, a public commitment to civilizing the township. The Donnellys refused to sign, refused to participate, refused to pretend a priest who'd publicly condemned them was someone they could trust. This confirmed Father Connolly's judgment. The Donnellys were rejecting peace, rejecting community, rejecting the moral authority of the church. They were, as he'd suspected, the source of the problem. But here's what Father Connolly didn't understand. Peace societies only work when everyone agrees on who deserves peace, when everyone agrees on what counts as crime, when everyone agrees on whose version of events to believe. In Biddulph Township, no such agreement existed. The Peace Society became a weapon, a way to isolate the Donnellys, a way to legitimize hatred as moral righteousness. By fall 1879, the Peace Society had split. The more radical members formed a splinter group, the Vigilance Committee. They met at the Cedar Swamp Schoolhouse, a one-room building isolated enough for secret gatherings, close enough to Roman line to watch Donnelly movements, still standing today as a storage shed. Constable James Carroll joined the Vigilance Committee, the man supposed to enforce law, the man whose job was protecting all citizens equally. He joined a group dedicated to targeting one specific family, a group that met in secret, a group whose name, Vigilance Committee, implied they would take action law enforcement wouldn't. Carroll had been fighting with the Donnellys for years. Over religion, they associated with Protestants. Over politics, they refused to follow Irish Catholic solidarity rules. Over law enforcement, they challenged his authority, questioned his arrests, insisted on trials instead of accepting punishment. He hated them personally, saw them as threats professionally, wanted them gone. Now he had a group of men who agreed, 20, maybe 30, possibly 35 depending on which meeting. Farmers, neighbors. Men who'd known the Donnellys for decades. Men who'd attended school with Donnelly children. Men who'd worked alongside them at logging bees and barn raisings. Men who'd shared drinks and stories and the casual intimacy of small rural communities. Men who'd decided that knowing someone for decades didn't matter if you hated them enough. On January 10th, 1880, Constable James Carroll wrote a letter. It survives in the archives at the University of Western Ontario, Box 4, 877, File 34. Read what he wrote. I have made no arrest yet of any of the sons, but will, I think, pretty soon. I am getting a case against Robert for arson. I expect in about 5 weeks to have the case with evidence strong enough to convince judge and jury that Robert is the man who 2 years ago burned out a farmer. January 10th. 25 days before the massacre, Carroll is planning to arrest Robert Donnelly for arson, building a case, gathering evidence, working through legal channels. But he won't wait. He has another plan, a faster plan, a plan that doesn't require evidence or judges or juries. 5 days later, on January 15th, 1880, Patrick Ryder's barn burned. Night, winter cold. The barn exploding into flames, fire spreading faster than anyone could respond, the structure collapsing in showers of sparks. Neighbours gathered, watching helplessly, asking the question everyone asked when buildings burned in Biddulph. Who did this? The Donnelly boys. Obviously. Everyone knew. Everyone said so. Except all the Donnelly boys were at a wedding that night, with witnesses. An airtight alibi verified by multiple people who'd seen them. Talked to them, shared drinks with them miles from Ryder's barn. They couldn't have set the fire. Physically impossible. Dozens of witnesses confirmed their location. Patrick Ryder had them arrested anyway. James Donnelly Sr., 63 years old. Johanna Donnelly, 56. Arrested for arson without evidence, without witnesses, without anything except Ryder's accusation and the community's willingness to believe the Donnellys were guilty of everything. The case went before a magistrate. No evidence presented. Adjourned. Another hearing. Still no evidence. Adjourned. A third hearing. Still nothing connecting the Donnellys to the fire. Scheduled to reconvene February 4th. After the third adjournment, word spread through Biddulph Township. The case would be dismissed. No evidence existed. The Donnellys would walk free. Again. Some members of the community had had enough. They decided to take the law into their own hands once they heard there was no supporting evidence linking the Donnellys to the barn fire. Think about that logic. The absence of evidence proved the Donnellys' guilt. The fact that they couldn't be convicted proved the justice system was broken. The fact that they had alibis proved they were clever criminals who'd planned ahead. There was no evidence because they were innocent. But innocence didn't matter. The community had decided the Donnellys were guilty. Evidence was irrelevant. Alibis were tricks. Legal proceedings were obstacles. Justice, in the minds of the Vigilance Committee, required eliminating the Donnellys before the court could free them. On February 3rd, 1880, a Monday, the last ordinary day the Donnelly family would ever experience, James Donnelly Sr. walked to the post office in Lucan and mailed a letter to his lawyer, Mr. Meredith in London. The letter asked Meredith to be ready to post bail and take their case before a judge. Explained that the family wanted proper legal representation because there was not the slightest cause for their arrest. That letter was found after his death. Evidence that James Donnelly, even at 63, even after decades of violence and feuding and reputation-destroying events, still believed in law. Still believed judges would see reason. Still believed evidence mattered. He was wrong about all of it. That same day, February 3rd, 1880, the Donnelly homestead continued its ordinary rhythms. Thomas and James Sr. and Johanna preparing for court the next day, cleaning clothes, feeding animals, planning logistics. John Donnelly left midday, walked 4 miles to William Donnelly's house in Wayland's Corners to borrow a sleigh. They'd need transportation to court. William had a good sleigh. John would bring it back, pick up his parents and Thomas, drive them to the courthouse for their 9 o'clock appearance. John decided to stay overnight at Williams, sleep in a real bed instead of walking home in the dark. Martin Hogan Sr., a friend, was already there. They'd make a party of it, tell stories, share drinks, sleep late since William didn't need his sleigh until morning. If John had stayed home, he'd have died in the fire with his parents. Instead, he slept at his brother's house. He'd be shot dead answering William's door at 2 o'clock in the morning. The mob would make sure no adult Donnelly man survived the night. At the homestead, Johnny O'Connor arrived, the son of Michael O'Connor, a family friendly to the Donnellys. Age 11 or 15 depending on which source you trust. Probably 13, splitting the difference. Hired to help with chores while the family attended court. Feed the pigs, water the horses. Simple work for a farm boy. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, William Casey stood in his front yard on Roman Line and heard the sound of a horse and cart approaching. The Donnellys speeding past. Moving recklessly, Casey thought. Fast enough that he stopped what he was doing to watch, noting the time. 4 o'clock. February sunset came early. 5:30 at that latitude. Temperature dropping as daylight faded. James Sr., Thomas and Johnny riding together. Sound of hooves on frozen ground, passing Casey's farm. Last time Casey would see any of them alive. They returned home, did evening chores by lantern light. Johnny testified later. I went out to feed the pigs with Thomas. He gave me a whip to whip the pigs. We fed the horses and did the chores. We came into the house and eat some apples. Pigs squealing as fed. Horses stamping in cold. Back to the house, stamping snow off boots. Kitchen warm from the cook stove. Eating apples. The ordinary texture of rural life. Nothing suggesting this night would be different from any other. Around 8 or 9 o'clock, testimony varies, James Feehely arrived. Sat at the kitchen table. Talked to Thomas, Bridget, and Johanna. Small talk. Weather. Court tomorrow. Coffee or tea, probably. The casual hospitality frontier families extended to neighbours, even when those neighbours were planning to kill them. Feehely's eyes taking in everything. Who was home, where they'd sleep, layout of rooms. He saw Johnny O'Connor and likely assumed the boy was John Donnelly. Expected one more adult man in the house. He noted where everyone would be sleeping. He memorized details. Feehely left around 9. Good night. See you soon. The Donnellys had no idea how soon. Thomas retired to the bedroom off the back kitchen. James Sr. and Johnny went to bed in the front room. The old man and the boy sharing a bed because that's how frontier houses worked. Space was limited. Body heat was valuable in February. Johanna and Bridget sleeping together in the middle room. 5 people settling in for the night. Doors unlocked. No weapons ready. No sense of danger. 3 miles away, the Vigilance Committee gathered at the Cedar Swamp schoolhouse. Men arriving on foot, by horse. February cold, breath visible in moonlight. Lanterns lit inside the one-room building. Whiskey bottles passing hand to hand. Voices getting louder as alcohol did its work. They'll get off tomorrow. We have to do something. Tonight. At least 20 men. Possibly 30. Maybe 35. Constable James Carroll leading them. Thomas Ryder. James Ryder. John Kennedy. Married to Jenny Donnelly. James and Johanna's only daughter. Willing to kill his wife's parents. Martin McLaughlin. John Purtell. Patrick Ryder. Big Mike Heenan. William Carroll. And others whose names were never recorded or were deliberately forgotten. They brought weapons. Axes. Guns. Pitchforks. Shovels. Wooden clubs. Handcuffs. Carroll brought his constable's handcuffs, planning to make this look like an arrest. Some wore disguises. Most didn't bother. Everyone would know who they were anyway. They drank. Quarts of whiskey. Called it water of life. Liquid courage to numb their senses and enhance their motivation and make it possible to do what they'd come to do. Getting drunk enough to murder people they'd known for decades. People they'd attended church with. People whose children they'd taught to read. People who were, despite everything, human beings with names and histories and families who loved them. The committee had been planning since August, meeting in secret, building consensus, deciding the Donnellys had to go. But planning is different from doing. Theory is different from practice. Talking about violence is different from committing it. That's why they needed whiskey, to cross the gap between intention and action, to transform neighbors into killers. We don't know exactly what they planned. Beat the family? Force confessions? Extract promises to leave Biddulph forever? Scare them into submission? What we know is they brought axes and pitchforks and shovels. What we know is they got drunk enough to use them. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, they left the Cedar Swamp schoolhouse. 20 to 35 men, armed, drunk, walking 3 miles through February darkness toward the Donnelly homestead on Roman Line. 4 miles away, at William Donnelly's house in Wayland's Corners, John Donnelly and Martin Hogan were asleep. Nora Donnelly asleep in another room. William Donnelly asleep beside her. None of them knowing anyone was coming. At the homestead, 5 people slept. James Sr., 63, Johanna, 56, Thomas, 26, Bridget, 21, Johnny O'Connor, 13. They had locked no doors. They expected no violence. The court hearing was in 8 hours. Everything seemed manageable. In 90 minutes, 4 of them would be dead. In 3 hours, 5. Everything we know about what happened in that house comes from one source: an 11-year-old boy hiding under a bed. His testimony was sworn February 21st, 1880, 17 days after the massacre. Public Archives of Ontario, Irving Fons, F1027, Volume 8208. His name was Johnny O'Connor, and this is what he saw. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, February 4th, 1880, Constable James Carroll entered the Donnelly homestead through the back kitchen door. He carried a candle. He wore his constable's badge. He held handcuffs. Thomas Donnelly was asleep in the bedroom off the kitchen. Woke to the sound of the door opening. Woke to Carroll standing over him. Woke to metal clicking around his wrists. "You're under arrest." The sound woke Bridget and Johanna in the middle bedroom. Woke James Sr. and Johnny in the front room. The house stirring, people confused, half asleep, not understanding yet. Carroll went to the front room, woke James Sr. fully. Johnny O'Connor, terrified, passed the old man his coat, the routine gesture of a boy trying to be helpful while his world fractures. James Sr. asked the question, "What have you got against us now?" Carroll responded they were being charged with another crime. Didn't specify what. Didn't produce a warrant, just the vague authority of a constable making an arrest in the middle of the night. Thomas, handcuffed in the kitchen, said Carroll thought he was smart. Asked to see the warrant, the legal document that would authorize this arrest, the paper that would make this legitimate. Carroll said there was lots of time for that. Then a whole crowd jumped in and commenced hammering them with sticks and spades. That's Johnny's exact phrase. A whole crowd jumped in. Not walked in. Not entered. Jumped. The sudden violence of men who'd been waiting outside, weapons ready, for Carroll's signal. 20 men, maybe more, filling the small house, clubs swinging, shovels raised. The sound of wood and metal hitting flesh, the sound of bones breaking, the sound of people screaming. Johnny O'Connor was still in bed when they came in. Got under the bed. Could see out into the front room from where he was lying. The bed was opposite the door against the wall. Perfect sightline. Worst possible view. James Sr. was beaten rapidly. James Maher struck his head repeatedly. Fatal injuries. The first blows dropping the 63-year-old man. He fell to the ground. They kept hitting him, kept swinging, long after he stopped moving. Johanna tried to pray, got on her knees, hands clasped, asking God, or the men, or anyone for mercy. It was Carroll's club that ended her life. The constable who was supposed to protect her, the man of law. He beat a 56-year-old woman to death while she prayed. Thomas ran, handcuffed, but running. Out of the kitchen, through the front room, out the front door, running into February darkness, running for his life. He didn't make it far. Tom Ryder caught him with a pitchfork, struck him repeatedly. Thomas trying to escape with the weapon still in him. Thomas trying to run with a pitchfork in his back, trying to escape men who'd known him since childhood. One of the men yelled, "Hit him on the head with a spade." A man slammed Thomas with a shovel. Another buried a pickaxe in his head. A third swung a shovel's blade. The killing blow. 26 years old, killed in his parents' front yard. They carried Tom's body inside, continued striking him, making sure, making certain. The injuries were so severe he couldn't be identified later. Bridget ran upstairs. Johnny saw her run from the kitchen through the front room toward the stairs. He got out from under the bed and followed her, trying to help, trying to do something. A 13-year-old boy watching murders and still trying to help. Bridget shut the door after her. Johnny ran back to the bedroom, got behind a clothes basket under the bed, hiding in a different spot, praying they wouldn't find him. Several men went upstairs, sounds of struggle. Bridget screaming or pleading or fighting. We don't know. Johnny couldn't see, could only hear. They brought back Bridget's limp body, dumped it on her Uncle Tom's corpse, 21 years old, in Canada, 18 months, dead because she was sleeping in the wrong house. The men set the house on fire, started in the kitchen, flames spreading fast through the wooden structure, smoke filling rooms. The heat building, 4 bodies on the floor, 1 boy hiding under a bed. Johnny O'Connor crawled out, the house burning around him, ran barefoot into February night, ran through darkness toward the Whelan farm half a mile away, bare feet on frozen ground, looking back and seeing the whole place in a blaze, orange flames against black sky, smoke rising in a column visible for miles. Arrived at Whelan's, pounded on the door, Patrick and Anne Whelan answering, seeing a terrified barefoot boy, seeing the fire in the distance, understanding immediately. Patrick Whelan thought he saw one of the bodies inside the burning house. He and Johnny went back, walked as close as the heat allowed, saw a big patch of blood near the front door, where Thomas had been caught, where he'd been killed, where his head had been severed, 4 bodies burning. The house collapsing, nothing to be done. Mrs. Whelan put Johnny to bed. What else could she do? The boy had watched 4 people beaten to death, had hidden while they burned the house, had run barefoot through winter darkness, had looked at blood on snow and bodies in flames. She put him to bed, but the mob wasn't finished. They walked 4 miles to William Donnelly's house in Wayland's Corners, arriving around 2 o'clock in the morning. 20 men, maybe fewer now. Some had gone home. Enough remained, enough for more killing. Inside the house, William and Nora Donnelly asleep in one room. John Donnelly and Martin Hogan asleep in another. 4 people who had no idea anyone was coming. No idea what had happened at the homestead. No idea 30 people they'd known their entire lives had just committed mass murder. The mob knocked on the door, pounded, shouted. Jim Ryder yelled, "Fire! Open the door!" John Donnelly answered. Opened the door to neighbours, to people he knew, to men he'd worked alongside. They shot him, a blaze of gunfire, multiple gunshots at point-blank range. Medical examiners would later count more than 30 wounds. John Donnelly killed in his doorway for the crime of being born a Donnelly. One of the men said, "I guess that takes care of my brother-in-law." John Kennedy, married to Jenny Donnelly, father to her children, believing he'd just killed his wife's brother William, actually killed William's brother John, close enough for Kennedy. Any Donnelly would do. William Donnelly peered through his bedroom window, saw Big Mike Heenan, saw William Carroll, saw Patrick Ryder, saw his brother-in-law John Kennedy. Saw Constable James Carroll, faces he knew, names he would remember, men who would sit in his church, who would pass him on the street, who would live free for the rest of their lives. Martin Hogan crawled on his knees to where John lay bleeding in the doorway. Nora couldn't pull John to safety. Too heavy, too much blood. Hogan grabbed him, dragged him inside. Blood trail across the floor. John Donnelly died 5 minutes later, 32 years old, shot dead by his sister's husband. The mob surrounded the house, circled it for 3 hours, 2 o'clock until 5, waiting for someone to show their face, waiting for another chance to kill. Footsteps crunching in snow, shadows passing windows, William and Nora and Martin hiding in darkness, John's body cooling on the floor, blood spreading. 3 hours of terror while the mob decided whether to burn this house too. The men were exhausted. They'd already murdered 4 people, burned a house, walked 4 miles, shot another man, been awake all night drinking and killing. Jim Feely, the spy who'd visited the Donnelly house earlier that evening, said, "There's been enough bloodshed tonight, boys. Let's go home." They left. Would have continued to Big Jim Keefe's house otherwise. Would have killed more Donnellys. Would have kept going until every adult male with that surname was dead. 5 murders was enough. For now. Dawn came. February morning. Cold and clear. Neighbours came to view the burned Donnelly home. Some to help, some to mourn, some to scavenge for souvenirs from the wreckage, taking pieces of the house, taking items that had belonged to the dead. Collecting mementos of a massacre, 4 bodies in the ruins. The fire had been so intense they couldn't be distinguished from each other. James, Johanna, Thomas, Bridget. The remains were unrecognizable. Johnny O'Connor woke at 8 o'clock. Mrs. Whelan gave him breakfast. Then he went back to the Donnelly place, saw the bodies, saw 4 shapes that used to be people he'd known. Could not distinguish them. The fire had done its work. He and Joe Whelan got a horse and rode to Lucan. Johnny found his father and mother there, found his 2 brothers. His mother started laughing when she saw him wearing a big hat. Teresa Whelan had given it to him, asked where his overcoat was. She laughed, not because anything was funny, because her son was alive, barefoot, wearing someone else's hat, covered in soot, but alive. 4 people he'd slept near last night were now burned corpses, and Johnny O'Connor was the only person who could identify the killers. By noon on February 4th, everyone in Biddulph Township knew what had happened, knew the Donnellys were dead, knew who did it, knew why. The question was, would anyone do anything about it? The afternoon of February 4th, 1880, Coroner Thomas Hossack gathered a jury to begin hearing testimony. 6 hours after the murders, the bodies still smoking in the ruins, Johnny O'Connor still wearing someone else's hat. The coroner's inquest would meet 3 times. February 11th, February 18th, March 2nd. Testimony from dozens of witnesses, Johnny O'Connor's detailed account, William Donnelly's identification of the attackers at his house. Physical evidence from the crime scenes, blood, weapons, 30 bullet holes in John Donnelly's chest. The verdict, murdered by persons unknown. Johnny O'Connor knew all the persons who did the killing, identified them easily, named James Carroll, named the riders, named John Kennedy, named everyone he'd seen from under that bed, everyone who'd beaten his hosts to death while he watched. His testimony was disregarded because of his age, 11 years old, or 13, or 15. Sources varied on his exact age, but agreed on one fact: too young to be credible, too young to be believed, too young for his word to matter against grown men, respected men, men with families and reputations and friends willing to lie for them. The day after the coroner began his inquest, February 5th, 13 men were arrested. James Carroll, Thomas Ryder, James Ryder, John Kennedy, Martin McLaughlin, John Purtell, and 7 others whose names would disappear from the official record as charges were quietly dropped. February 6th, the funeral. St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church. The same church where James Donnelly had stood up and denounced Father Connolly's anti-Protestant preaching. The same church where Father Connolly had formed the Peace Society that spawned the Vigilance Committee that murdered 5 people 2 days earlier. 5 coffins. James Sr., Johanna, Thomas, Bridget, John. Closed caskets because the bodies were too damaged for viewing. Fire and violence had made them unrecognizable. Father Connolly delivered the funeral address, wept openly, swore he had no enmity against the family, claimed he'd never wanted this. The community was split over whether to believe him, whether to mourn or celebrate, whether the Donnellys had gotten what they deserved or suffered an atrocity. The surviving Donnellys sat in the front row, William, Patrick, Robert, Jenny, burying their parents, 3 brothers, and a cousin in one ceremony. Behind them, the killers, sitting in the congregation, men they'd known their entire lives, men who'd murdered their family 48 hours earlier, sitting in church, praying, acting bereaved. William Donnelly had heard some of their voices in his yard at 2 o'clock in the morning, had seen their faces through his window. John Kennedy, Big Mike Heenan, James Carroll, the men who'd shot his brother John, the men who were now pretending to mourn. Everyone knew who'd done it. Everyone sitting in that church knew exactly who'd committed mass murder. The killers knew. The victim's family knew. The priest knew. The congregation knew. And everyone pretended they didn't. February 21st through March 13th. Preliminary hearing. 6 prisoners committed for trial. James Carroll, John Kennedy, Martin McLaughlin, Thomas Ryder, James Ryder, John Purtell. The ones the Crown believed they could prove were there. The ones Johnny O'Connor could identify with certainty. The ringleaders. The other 7 were released. Not enough evidence. Not enough witnesses. Not enough courage from a community that wanted this to go away. Johnny O'Connor testified again, at length, described everything he'd seen. The newspapers published his testimony verbatim. Readers across Ontario learned what an 11-year-old boy had witnessed from under a bed. The detail was nauseating. The precision was undeniable. His account never wavered. The defense attacked his age, his reliability, the lighting conditions. How could he be certain who he saw? How could he identify people in darkness? How could anyone trust the word of a child against respectable men with alibis and character witnesses? But Johnny never changed his story, never contradicted himself, answered every question, pointed at the defendants, named them, described what they'd done. Young Johnny was not deterred from testifying by any of the group's activities, and the Vigilance Committee tried hard. Michael O'Connor, Johnny's father, owned 2 houses on Francis Street in Lucan. One had allegedly run a bootlegging operation. The other he rented to Robert Donnelly. During the late evening of April 13th, 2 months after the massacre, vigilantes burned the O'Connor house to the ground. Message clear. Your son testifies. You lose everything. The O'Connors didn't stop. Johnny kept testifying. His mother Mary walked through Lucan despite the threats. When Patrick Grouchy Ryder confronted her on the street, threatened her, insulted her, she laid charges against him for using abusive language. At Ryder's court appearance, fellow vigilantes swore he was in Biddulph at the time of the alleged incident. Couldn't have been in Lucan threatening Mrs. O'Connor. Had witnesses. Had alibis. The case was dismissed. The pattern was established. The vigilantes would lie for each other, would provide alibis, would intimidate witnesses, would burn houses, would do whatever necessary to avoid conviction, and the community would let them. October 4th, 1880, 8 months after the murders. The first trial opened in London, Ontario. James Carroll charged with the murder of Johanna Donnelly, not James Sr., not Thomas, not Bridget, not John, Johanna. The woman Carroll had beaten to death with a club while she prayed. Crown Prosecutor Emilius Irving led the prosecution. The defence consisted of Hugh McMahon, William Meredith, and John Blake. 3 excellent lawyers defending a man who'd led a mob that killed 5 people. The witness list was extensive. William Donnelly, Nora Donnelly, Martin Hogan, Johnny O'Connor, Patrick and Anne Whelan, medical examiners, police chiefs, character witnesses for both sides. Johnny O'Connor testified again. His account was the same, unchanged from February, unchanged from the preliminary hearing, unchanged despite months of intimidation and a burned house and threats against his parents. Tom told him to read the warrant. Carol said there was lots of time for that. Then in a few minutes a whole crowd jumped in and commenced hammering them with sticks and spade. Then Tom ran out into the front room and outside. I saw him. The jury heard everything, saw the evidence, listened to William Donnelly identify the men at his house, listened to Johnny describe in precise detail what happened in the Donnelly homestead, heard medical testimony about the injuries, saw the weapons, understood exactly what had occurred. Justice Armour issued a strong charge to the jury. The evidence was clear. The testimony was credible. The law required conviction. The jury deliberated from 4:30 in the afternoon until 10:30 at night. 6 hours. Then announced they couldn't reach a verdict. 7 jurors voted to acquit. 4 voted to convict. 1 was undecided. 1 juror declared publicly that he would not have convicted James Carroll even if he had seen the killings himself, even if he'd stood in that house and watched Carroll beat Johanna Donnelly to death, even if he'd seen it with his own eyes. He would not convict. Another juror said he didn't want to convict Carroll on Johnny O'Connor's word alone. A child's testimony wasn't enough, despite the physical evidence, despite the other witnesses, despite everything. The rest voted for acquittal out of fear. Fear of the dozens of others involved. Fear of tearing the community apart. Fear of what would happen if they convicted one of their own. Newspaper reporters covering the trial believed the Donnelly brothers, described William and Patrick as intelligent and well-spoken. Had a hard time believing the family were the ruffians locals described. The press described James Carroll and his companions as a bunch of envious, dangerous backwoodsmen with sinister appearance. But the jury wouldn't convict, couldn't convict. The evidence didn't matter. The testimony didn't matter. Johnny O'Connor's courage didn't matter. What mattered was that convicting Carroll meant admitting the community had produced murderers, meant acknowledging that priests and constables and farmers and neighbors, people they knew, people they lived with, people they called friends, had committed an atrocity. Easier to pretend the evidence was insufficient. Easier to dismiss a child's testimony. Easier to let them all go free. Attorney General Mowat decided not to wait until spring for another trial. Appointed 2 justices, Matthew Crooks Cameron and Featherstone Osler. The second trial took place January 24th through February 2nd, 1881, almost exactly 1 year after the murders. This time, the trial was smaller, faster. Judge Cameron steered the proceedings toward acquittal. An old Conservative Party leader described as an old Tory mugwump, making sure the right result occurred. The jury found Carroll not guilty of murder. The rest of the prisoners were granted bail and never tried for the Donnelly murders. Not Thomas Ryder, not James Ryder, not John Kennedy, not Martin McLaughlin, not John Purtell. Not any of the other 15 or 20 or 35 men who'd participated. None of them. Crown Attorney Charles Hutchinson stated it was a waste of time and money trying to secure a guilty verdict in Middlesex County because of the negative feelings toward the Donnellys. The community hated them. The jury pool was poisoned. No conviction was possible. The calculation was simple. Convicting Carroll meant convicting 20 or more men, meant tearing apart entire families, meant acknowledging that a substantial portion of the Catholic community in Biddulph had participated in mass murder, meant riots, meant deeper violence, meant chaos. Easier to let it go. Easier to decide these particular victims didn't deserve justice. Easier to move on. A 1931 Maclean's article explained it clearly. I suspect it was this comprehensive aspect of the case, its proportions and the outlook it created, that stood in the way of convicting the lynchers. If Carroll were proved guilty, it would follow that at least a score or 2 others might as readily be brought under condemnation. As the shock to the community subsided, one heard on every hand the question raised as to the expediency of trying practically a whole countryside. Not whether they were guilty, whether it was expedient to convict them. The surviving Donnellys lived with this. William Donnelly, who'd watched his brother shot, who'd identified the killers, who'd testified at both trials, became a constable in Glencoe. Worked in law enforcement despite watching law enforcement fail his family completely. Died 1897 at age 52. Carried the memories for 17 years. Patrick Donnelly moved to Thorold, Ontario. Became a wagon maker. The good son, who never got into much trouble. Escaped the massacre by living elsewhere. Died 1914 at age 65, having outlived the violence by pure geographic luck. Robert Donnelly did time in the penitentiary. Ended up in London Psychiatric Hospital in 1908. Died there 3 years later at age 58. The trauma and violence that had defined his family had broken something in him that never healed. Jenny Donnelly married Constable James Curry in 1883, had several children, lived quietly in Glencoe, died 1916 at age 59, the last surviving Donnelly, the only one who lived a normal span of years. Johnny O'Connor disappeared into history. No reliable information exists about what became of him. Some sources say Toronto, some say Saskatchewan, some say California. He likely carried the trauma of what he'd seen for the rest of his life. Probably died in the 1940s or 50s, an old man who'd spent 60 or 70 years remembering 4 people beaten to death while he hid under a bed. James Carroll moved to Kimberley, British Columbia, in 1907, 27 years after the murders. Died there 1915 at approximately age 70. Free man. Never punished. Never held accountable. Father John Connolly continued serving at St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church until 1895. 15 more years preaching to the congregation that had produced a death squad. Died 1909. Still a priest. Still respected. The community suppressed the story. Information about the family and events surrounding their deaths was locally buried for most of the 20th century because many residents had ancestors who'd been involved. In 1889, Robert Donnelly erected a massive tombstone in St. Patrick's Cemetery, listed all 5 victims, under each name, murdered February 4th, 1880. The word carved in stone, refusing to let the community forget. The tombstone became a tourist attraction. People came to see it, take photographs, chip pieces off as souvenirs. By 1964, the parish priest had had enough. Ordered it removed. Too much attention. Too many questions. Too much remembering. One of the Donnelly descendants claimed the marker, said it was buried in an undisclosed location. It was replaced with a smaller marker. Just names. Just dates. The word murdered, omitted, erased, forgotten. As final insult, John J. Kennedy, one of the mob members who'd killed the family, the man who'd shot his own brother-in-law, is buried in the plot next to the Donnellys, his family resting beside the family he helped destroy. Forever.